What is the role of the state? The very understanding of how our government works is a Trinitarian understanding. We're where we are because of where we've been. And so you gotta know what that path has been so you can steer the car. But the chief goal of the state is to subdue evil.
If it doesn't know what's good, it will restrain good.
Bingo. And if you think that the way government is run doesn't have echoes in the families of this country, you're high.
Welcome back to the MakeReady Podcast. My name is Brian Sims, and Ron Dodson is back today. He's coming in hot with politics, government, how God infects all of it, how Christians should be involved in politics. This is such a great conversation that I am very excited to share with you. Let's go. Ron Dodson, welcome back again. This is going to be a regular thing, so the third time means, now it's tradition.
Now we're getting to the real, it's either the really interesting or the really prosaic stuff.
Well, when does your name have to go on the podcast? That's the question.
Oh, I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in that. Give me a little bit of...
The Ron Dodson Hour.
Yeah.
Today.
Everybody's interested in that.
You tweeted something that I'm very interested in.
Okay. As I sit here suddenly sweating.
Which one, because of the 12 things I tweeted, about the Constitution being written in a time when Trinitarian Christianity was not only the norm, but that was the intent, that Trinitarian Christianity would be what guides this country.
Yeah, the expectation. So we live in a pluralistic reality, and that was and pluralism, whether you agree with it or not. And I have some real questions with regards to pluralism. I'll admit from the
define pluralism for me.
Well, I'll get there.
Okay,
I think I will. Maybe not. Okay. So pluralism is the idea that you're going to allow into the public square a multiplicity of ideas. Okay. And what in its modern context, in a cosmopolitan pluralism context, that means that basically you treat all comers regardless of presuppositional framework, regardless of whatever your basic assumptions are, you treat them all as equal. So the idea is, and that was not always the issue. Pluralism, as the founders understood it, was a Trinitarian pluralism. In other words, we're not going to demand that everybody be a Congregationalist, that everyone is a Baptist, or that everyone's a Presbyterian, or everyone's an Anglican, or that everyone's Catholic. But we're going to allow the states to decide that. And I think it was 9 out of the 13. That number could be wrong, but
most.
I think, a super majority of states had establishment. An establishment, big E establishment is the idea, and I am going to very secretly turn that on focus mode. The idea here is that you had a super majority of states that were establishment. Had an established church, and that's what big E establishment is. And so there was a constitutional from the Bill of Rights, not during our first the first republic, so to speak, under the Articles of Confederation, but in the Bill of Rights under the Constitution, you had this idea that the federal government for the entire nation would not establish an official religion. And everybody understood that meant establish an official Christian religion. Mm-hmm. Because the states, and the reason was that the citizens of the Union were the states, and then the people were citizens of the individual states. So
states elected senators.
So the Union was the union of states, mm-hmm. and the states themselves had far more often than not an established Christian denomination themselves. Maryland was Catholic. And Rhode Island, I believe, was Baptist, and so on and so forth. In the South, you had it was more in the southern states more Anglican, but I don't remember the specifics. And in the states that didn't have an official state established church, you did have a requirement for church membership, professed faith, and so on and so forth in order to serve in government. And so the pluralism, or the idea that we're going to allow for a varied perspective into the public square had a Trinitarian. That was a given in the early,
it was understood.
really until probably the 1880s, 1890s. That was understood. That survived, I think. What started to break it down was the northern churches and denominations, especially your Puritan parts of the country, really kind of devolved into a congregational and then into a very liberal kind of Unitarian idea. And so that started to break it down.
Which it continues to this day.
Oh, absolutely. Well, if they're, and so that's why, so the idea that you could assume a Trinitarian, Unitarianism is obviously not Trinitarian. And so that idea started to fall apart. And then with the huge influx of Jews coming from, Germany became Germany in the mid 1800s, about the same time as our Civil War, from a collection of duchies into a unified Germanic state, Deutschland. And so that there were many Jews who decided they didn't want to, they'd rather come over here when we were bringing in Italians and Irish and so on and so forth. And the reason we were great with that is we had an entire continent to fill up post Civil War. And that's really the part of the foundation of the Civil War. And I'm a proud Southerner, I'm not super happy with everything Lincoln did, for sure. Although if he hadn't been assassinated, Reconstruction probably would have been less severe. I'll say that, because he was a bit of a moderating voice. But anyway, point being is that you had to import people to fill up the continent, because if we didn't do that, somebody else would have. The Spanish, the Brits could have leapfrogged us, through Canada, the French. Mexico made a play, but they were. Mexico was never, once it had its independence, was never super strong.
The gold rush for nations was land.
But the gold rush for nations was land, and so the country realized we had to get to that other coast, and so you imported a bunch of people. Point being is, when you import Irish and Italian, and they are Catholic, and the country was, in its founding, was vast majority Protestant. I mean, the country the leadership was Anglican, the government structure populated by Anglicans, but the structure was Presbyterian, and then the people were largely, more often than not, Baptist, by some form of Baptist. And so, but when you started bringing in Italians and Irish, those are majority Catholic. And then the Jews obviously are not Christian, as much as some evangelicals would like for them to be assumed as such.
It's another topic.
It is another topic. But so that pluralism became more and more a radical pluralism. And so, and especially, the first wave of Jewish immigration was elite. And so that that group immediately, very literate, very erudite, began to have a large say in industry and leadership in those areas they participated in. And so, Judaism by necessity, because it is outside of, there was no Israel at this time, obviously. It was just British Palestine, or Ottoman Palestine. The Jews were, as a people of a diaspora, were necessarily cosmopolitan, because otherwise they would have no say anywhere they went. And this was largely due to their experience in the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire. So if you're not familiar with this, I think this is incredibly interesting, because it does play a huge part in our modern political reality. Mm-hmm. So the Russian Empire was not just Russian, the Rus. There are 17 different ethnicities. And so it was a true empire, an emperor over a multitude of ethnicities, but Orthodox. And the elite spoke French, and they wrote in Russian, and the ordinary people spoke Russian. And then the Jews spoke Yiddish, which was kind of has a lot linguistically to do with Farsi, and then some German import and stuff, but culturally did not get along with the elite leadership group in Russia. It's a very interesting book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the devout Christian writer, called 200 Years Together. It's kind of controversial, but talks about this entire relationship between Russia and Russian Jews and everything. So eventually, through coercion, basically, they were all forced to live in what's called the Pale of Settlement. So the Baltic states, through Belarus and Poland, down through what we call Ukraine, which then back then was called the Ukraine, literally the frontier. And so Jews couldn't live in St. Petersburg or Moscow. They had to live in this Eastern European area, and to exert any type of authority in those areas, of course, they had to be cosmopolitan. They had to believe in a pluralistic idea, because if it was just a Christian public square, they would have no say. So when they came to the United States, that was the immediate political push that they gave to things, that this is where the term Judeo-Christian comes from. That is not a historic term. That term never appears before the 20th century.
Really? I didn't know that.
No, it was, I won't say, well, it was a coinage of the 20th century, popularizing this cosmopolitan idea that our public square is not just pluralistic in a Trinitarian sense, but is radically pluralistic. So what does that mean? That means that I don't have to have the same view of God as you. God is not, it doesn't have to be Jesus. He doesn't have to exist in Trinity. I don't even have to believe anything. I can be an atheist and still have a voice in the public square. What's the public square? Political speech, newspaper speech, and everything. And so the understanding of the freedom of speech that we had originally in the Bill of Rights, which was Madison informed by John Witherspoon, who was his pastor, which would have assumed, again, a very traditional Christian Trinitarian deal, had eroded. And is that and now we champion that. And the problem is the very understanding of how our government works is a Trinitarian understanding, and how to best explain that. So in the Trinity, the relationship between the persons of the Trinity is revealed in the law by the idea of two witnesses. So nothing can be confirmed in the law without the testimony of two or three witnesses. We see this in the Trinity itself. Whenever all three persons, whenever one of the persons shows up, they always say, God the Father says, Oh, here's my son. Listen to him. And the Spirit is there as a witness. 2 witnesses to the veracity of the Son. Oh, I'm sending the Helper. The Helper's way better than me, because the Helper, I'm God, but I'm just a man. The Spirit can be anywhere. Listen to him. So you have this idea, and it's this eternal covenantal relationship between the participants of the Trinity is called perichoresis, which is a fancy word you don't need to know, but that's the basis of our government. Well, what do you mean, Ron? How is that the basis of our government? Because we have 3 branches, and it's the legislative and the executive and the judicial. And as it was originally understood, if ever there was a disagreement, it was 2 against 1. And that's how the idea that we operate under now, after years and years of seeing Marbury versus Madison interpreted, now we have this idea of judicial supremacy. And that is a cosmopolitan idea. It is not a Trinitarian idea. Ron, what do you mean? Because we don't believe God is a monad. There is not a judge that God exists in Trinity. He speaks with one voice, but in 3 persons. Mm-hmm. And so you need 2 witnesses. So the idea that the judiciary can speak and overrule the other 2 is foreign to the original intent, and is part of this whole, it's part of, I would argue, part of this move from original Trinitarian pluralism to this radical pluralism now.
When did that change?
Well, over time. I mean, Marbury versus Madison is the idea that gave us, is the decision that gave us judicial review. Mm-hmm. And there's a sense in which judicial review makes sense, that it is the purpose of the judiciary to decide if the legislation, if the legislative branch is legislating according to the Constitution. But the understanding is that if you see this in FDR, for instance, when he did his big program of all the 3-letter agencies and this huge social deal, which is absolutely by the letter unconstitutional, he had the legislative branch with him. It really didn't matter what the judiciary said, because it was 2 against 1. Right.
Because it will always function that way.
2 witnesses. Yeah. Exactly. And the judiciary saw the writing on the wall, so they didn't act against the president. Right. So, and then that after World War II kind of went away. I think part of it had to do with people, thought that FDR was acting as more than a president. He was kind of an imperial president. I'm not a huge FDR fan, but that's a good argument to be had. Part of the other deal was that you immediately saw the constitutional amendment in order to term limit the president. And everybody thinks, well, that's great. A president shouldn't serve more than 2 terms. But the problem is that term limit, I mean, that original idea of the president could serve as long as he was democratically elected always was an axe at his neck. And what I mean is Trump, for instance, right now doesn't have to worry about being reelected. So he has 0 democratic pressure on him. The will of the people. Now, seems like, the polls and everything are pretty much in his favor and anyway. But if he chose to be ultimately in a Republican democracy, the idea is the president should have the ultimate limiting force on him is the will of the people. And Trump doesn't have that over him now.
Right.
So anyway, point is that history has consequences. Mm-hmm. And the original intent often goes away due to the flows and fluctuations of history. So we're left, I would argue that we would be much better served with a Trinitarian pluralism. But that's not what we have. And honestly, most people would be, I think, probably against that. If it were the case where, that only a Trinitarian ideal was allowed in the public square, and everyone else was kind of a honored guest, so to speak. For instance, a Hindu comes here on an H-1B, and he ends up eventually applying for citizenship and being naturalized, and then he brings his family over, and suddenly he's got a whole community, and he wants to run for office. Well, our natural evolved American tendency is to say, well, good for him. He's exercising his rights. But realize that was not the original plan in America. The original plan was, well, if you're not just a Christian, but a Trinitarian Christian, so Mormons need not apply, Unitarians need not apply back then you just weren't allowed. Mm-hmm. And so I can hear everybody I can hear the groans right now of people listening to this and going, well, that's not American.
Right. That's
not an American ideal. Well, look around. If you don't have some type of common presuppositional framework fencing the public square, then you have some level of chaos. And you can overdo order. Believe me, we've seen that done, 20th century. But if you have no bounds to order, then just realize you're going to pay a price for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, the argument comes that you don't want to legislate morality.
Okay.
But isn't all legislation morality?
Well, the whole concept of political theology is that every legal concept is just a secularized secularized understanding of how God works and the laws. You can understand a person's true theology by their politics. Mm-hmm. And how, if they were the chief lawgiver, how would they enact law? That'll tell you who someone's God is. I'm sorry, but a speed limit reflects a person's understanding of who God is. And we see this from Leviticus. There was a law that said that if you put a stairway to the roof of your house, you've got to put a railing around. Why? Because God, the law was some type of civil code that thought of each and every situation? No, it absolutely was not. There's nothing in the law, for instance, about water rights. And I promise you, water rights were hugely important in the ancient world as they are today. No, the point is that showed that God cares about the safety of his people, that what are you going to do when you go up in the cool, we didn't have air conditioning. You go up to get on your roof so that you have the breeze. You might have a little bit of wine, and now you're stumbling and you fall off your roof and you're dead. And now somebody's got to take care of your wife and kids. Right. God didn't want that happening. This is and that's how law reflects now. So a speed limit, school zones, income tax.
I mean, would you put it basically as the codification of common grace?
Well, I mean, I guess that's a way you could put it. I think it's most rightly understood that I wasn't prepared for that question. That's really good. I think that ultimately what I'm willing to say is that law reflects the view of God any civilization has. And so if you have a radical pluralism, so in other words, multiple gods of the public square, then you're going to get a very factionalized, confused set of laws. Mm-hmm. That it's just a reflection of whom you worship as a society. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not a theonomist. So the end game of this, for instance, like a Greg Bonson or a Rush Dooney, and I have a lot of respect for those guys, but they would be theonomists, that they would say that the law is a civil code. Then that's the law basically the Old Testament should form our civil laws. And I think it should give us it should give us a background to understand how to best reflect God's law in maturity. Let's just use the Bible as an example. Imagine that. How did Solomon apply the law? What's the first decision he makes? Well, you have two women who bring a baby. Now, does he follow the law word for word in order to come to a solution, or does he apply it with wisdom in order, basically performs a legal miracle? He says, oh, bring me a sword. Let's cut the baby in half, in order to provoke and to know who truly the mother is, right?
Right.
But the law nowhere says, oh, yeah, let's cut the baby in half.
Well, the law is intended to educate.
That's right. The law is intended to provide this. The law is your math facts when you're a kid. You know, your math facts, your Bob books. That's what the law is. Do you stop there? No. Now we get to go on to algebra, and if you're really an expert, then you get to go on to calculus, and I can, rotate a curve around an axis and find the volume of a shape in multiple dimensions.
Is that what that does?
Yeah, that's what that does. So the point is do you want, if you want this radical, and I don't mean radical, I mean by radical I mean taking it to its logical extreme where we are. If you want a pluralism that is complete and utterly egalitarian, okay, there's no order to it, then just know, again, you're going to get some level of chaos, and you absolutely are going to get some level of factionalism. So this is why now every time we have a presidential election and the other side wins, we get this entire swath of complete rule changes and everything changes. Why? Because you're coming from two pretty different, I know Biden said he was a faithful Catholic.
No, it's totally two different views of the world.
Completely two different, and in the biblical understanding and the Christendom understanding of how you order a society is, no, we're going to fence to some degree. The fence can be way out here, or the fence can be right here. And each society, that had to do with the homogeneity of a society. I don't think you're ever going to be able to fence in America. I mean, we have a multitude of different peoples. But if you don't have any fences to the public square, then realize you're going to get, politics is going to become war.
How do you decide what those reasonable restrictions are? Because I feel like you're basically throwing a gun on the floor and telling everybody, go.
Yeah, well, there's a really good book on this called The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, actually kind of a long essay, that talks about this. And again, the idea is, the modern idea became that that everybody just got into a room and we reached consensus. But let's imagine if those, you can easily understand why consensus in and of itself, if it's not guided by, as Christians, the Holy Spirit, for instance, if it's not guided by, as Christians, a common set of moral foundations, as Christians, a king we are all supposed to serve, if we don't at least have that, then you can see that consensus just becomes compromise.
Right.
And do you do math by compromise? Do you get the correct answer if you compromise? Imagine you had some amazing filmmaking auteur who had this unbelievable idea for a movie, okay? But it was going to be expensive. And so he goes to production studio X, 20th Century Fox, whatever. Does 20th Century Fox, it still exists, right? Columbia. I'm getting old.
I think it's just 20th century.
Whatever. And he says, "Hey, I need $200 million for this movie." And the production, the head of production came back and said, "Okay, we'll let you make this movie, but we're going to give you a co-writer in order to do so. You'll learn real quick how important the the coherence of that story is to the auteur, whether he says yes or no. In other words, if you get a co-writer, you're going to get some level of compromise in the story. So did God write the Bible by compromise? Did he say, "Hey, Satan, come on here to the
what are you willing to give?
What are you willing to give?" So that and you see this, Jesus, when he's tested in the wilderness, he said, do not put the Lord your God to the test. It's all about the compromise, right?
Yeah.
That he's unwilling to do because he's God. And so what is our political theology about that? That at some level, compromise is going to lead you astray.
It seems that compromise itself is the poison pill.
You said that. Send your cards and letters to Brian Sims, care of Compromise is Evil.
Obviously, you can take this
within
too
reason,
far.
Correct. The question is where do you put the fence?
Yeah.
This is the same. We're seeing the same thing with borders. The cosmopolitan idea is there really shouldn't be any borders. We're citizens of the world. A people's way of life is meaningless. We need a McDonald's at every corner, Starbucks across the street, and we're all just a soup of people. Yet this isn't biblical. In Revelation, after the consummation, after the great resurrection, after the city has come down, the river is flowing from the throne room, the throne of Jesus, and on either side of the river are the trees. And what are the trees? What's the fruit of the trees for? For the blessing of the nations. Somehow, nations, different ways of life, still governed by being discipled by Jesus. These different ways of life still exist. You see it. Let's go to Pentecost. Okay, so Pentecost. Here's some cool Bible. Pentecost is the reversal of the healing of the curse of Babel. So at Babel, let's build this massive ziggurat, this ladder to God, and we can be like God. It's kind of the writ large version of the sin of the garden, right? We can be like God. We're going to go up. And God confuses their speech. And disperses. Okay, and we get dispersed, and you ultimately get the 70 nations, the table of nations and everything. It's the reason why you had 70 bulls sacrificed at Feast of Tabernacles, the sacrifice for the nations of man. Well, at Pentecost, when that is, what's the miracle there? Well, the flames, the Holy Spirit. The veil is rent, the Holy Spirit goes out, and the flames rest upon each believer, and then they go out and preach the mighty works of God, and each person hears these mighty works in their own. It was either a miracle of speaking, or some say it was a miracle of hearing. It's not super clear from the text, but regardless, God didn't undo all the different languages. His glory was even more glorious as he's being heard and praised in all these different languages. It's like a diamond that's more beautiful because of all the different cuts, right? A manifold glory is how we would express that. So nations, languages, people groups have purpose, and each one of those have a little bit distinct way of life. And we respect, so there's some function to borders. The cosmopolitan maximalist position is just not biblical. And so, for instance, I might be Presbyterian, Reformed, and have a very high view of God's sovereignty. And Brian, you might be more Bible church and believer baptism and a more relational understanding of how the kingdom works. And we go across a border, and they might have a very Catholic understanding of families and how all that works together. And we might go up here, and it's different. And God seems to be honoring that in some level, at some level. And so borders seem to have a purpose at some level. And anyway, I've gone on way too long.
Well, I was going to take it towards this is right in this is the conversation around Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And this is where you will find as many definitions for Christian nationalism as you will find people in the world. But I think this is the correct definition of it, what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that okay, so again, this political theology way of understanding our politics, right? What is the role of the state? Well, we know from God's institution, and there's 3 institutions given by God, okay? Let's take them in order. The church, man meeting with God in his holy sanctuary. That's in Eden. Very soon after that, the family. God grants this wonderful, creates Eve out of the side of Adam and all that goes with that, and family, okay? And then ultimately children come from that. Okay, and then in a little bit later on in Genesis, you see with Noah the institution of the state. In other words, and what is the chief goal of the state? Not the total goal of the state, but the chief goal of the state is to subdue evil. Okay? If you shed man's blood, by man shall your blood be shed. Okay? We restrain evil. You see that recapitulated in Romans 13. For the magistrate does not bear the sword in vain. No, his job is to restrain evil. You have nothing to fear if you do good, right? In the best of situations, obviously, states can go bad, real bad.
Well, if it doesn't know what's good, it will restrain good.
Bingo. Absolutely. So we know that the state is to restrain evil. And then what's the pinnacle of the view, our view of the state? It's Jesus as king, right? Is Jesus one who just serves himself? Well, go back to Solomon. When the Jews, sometimes in our kindergarten understanding of the Bible, we think, well, the Jews should have just never had a king and blah, 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 you know. Well, that's not true, because even in Deuteronomy, it says that at one point you're going to want a king. And the law doesn't say that's bad. And Deuteronomy does not say that's bad. God, who's reciting Deuteronomy, is one big recitation given to Moses. It's as much God speaking as the revelation given to John in the Apocalypse in Revelation. And he says the king just must be limited to these 3 things. Okay, he must not, multiply, basically make a bunch of peace, turn his heart against the people by having all these different wives. Okay, in order to make peace treaties with all these, be covenantally bound to people who don't worship me. Okay, you must not make huge, gather for yourself many horses and chariots, which was offensive war. Okay, you defend yourself, but your job isn't to go conquer other people militarily. And then you shouldn't enrich yourself by taking in vast amounts. You don't enrich yourself at the people's expense by bringing in a bunch of gold. Solomon breaks all 3 of those. He marries 1,000, however many, in concubines as political treaties all over the place. He has 1,000, gets all these horses and chariots for the purposes of offensive war. And this is where this number comes from. And in 1 year, he collects for himself 666 talents of gold. So, in opposition to the king who goes bad, we see Jesus, who dies for his people, who feeds.
It's the inversion.
He feeds his people. He is Lord over them without lording over them. Jesus isn't here right now with a ruler, just right off camera here, ready to slap my wrist if I say something. I promise you, I've said something wrong. I'm a sinner, okay? But he's not compelling me like that. I'm a sinner. If he wasn't governed by his love for me, he'd just send me straight to hell, right? I mean, every instance of salvation is an act of grace and mercy. So the point being is that we see in the state it is kingly. It is for the purposes of subduing evil, and it is for the blessing of its people. And the Levites should have known Solomon had gone bad and either deposed or kill him. They chose not to, so the kingdom split. By the way, the northern tribes were not judged. They went off into idolatry and everything else, but they weren't judged immediately. In other words, God didn't say, yeah, they're wrong for splitting off. He doesn't say that. They go off, and it's basically a tax revolt. Solomon's demanding of them, 4 or 5 weeks of labor in order to come work on the temple as extra tax above the tithe. And to heck with this.
We're moving.
So, exactly. And we're going to set up a place in the north to worship.
Why do you think there's such, beyond it being just a pejorative for a lot of people, saying Christian nationalism is just wanting to dictate, you know?
No. Oh, you mentioned Christian nationalism. Yeah. So the idea is that the state owes, Jesus is for the blessing of the people in his kingdom. Okay. And making extra disciples so that making disciples of the other nations so that they might enter into his kingdom and he might bless them. Okay. So Christian, the right understanding of any type of national, a Christian understanding of nationalism is that a state's first loyalty is to its citizens. But why does that cause people to pause? Because we've had this huge time period where radical cosmopolitan egalitarian pluralism has become the understanding. And Jesus says, no, I have a specific people and I am here to bless them. And similarly, every ruler, every state, their job is to protect and bless their people to the exclusion of all others. We're not the rulers of Mexico. Yeah. It's not our job to take care of Mexico. It might be our job to subdue Mexico if they continue with the radical narco craziness that's going on. I don't think it'll come to that. I think, but who knows? It's not our job to go rule Canada, even though they've been a disaster since Cameron I can't remember if Cameron retired or was voted out. By the way, I'm an honorary Canadian. I'm married a Canadian. I still have tons of I have Canadian family. My kids are, in theory, dual citizens. So I love Canada, and I can't stand what's happened up there. But anyway, that's not our job to rule them. The U.S. government's job and each state's job it's the job of the Texas government to bless the citizens of Texas. It's the job of the national government of the United States to bless its citizens. But that goes back to a different understanding, and it's not a radical pluralism, and it's not a cosmopolitan ideal where borders don't matter. I'm not a citizen of the world. I am a citizen of Texas and of the United States of America. And I demand, just like my forefathers did, that the king, we don't have in theory a king, we have a chief executive.
Yeah.
The Hamiltonian understanding of a king, which is a chief executive, he is to be loyal to me. And when King George abdicated his responsibilities to the colonies, to Parliament, when the colonies had no representation in Parliament, they said, all bets are off. No, just as Jesus is our ultimate king, but we know he loves us. He has not abdicated us or forsaken us. George was a godly man. He was in a pickle. Made a very, very bad decision. But go back and read, not American history, but read the history of George. He was a family man. He wasn't much of a confrontationalist. He had a different understanding. They had allowed the colonies to have great independence. And I pretty much think, and this was the Canadian understanding, that if he had, because the Canadians were mostly Americans who just fled because they were loyal to the king, if he had come to his senses and said, no, I am exercising sovereignty and I will I will set up my representatives, my viceroys in America, that you might not have had the American Revolution. I don't know. Who knows? That's
because the rebellion was essentially against Parliament, not against King George.
Against Parliament. It was against Parliament and George's abdication of his loyalty to them.
They appealed to King George.
They sure did. He goes, and he did what Pontius Pilate did.
Not my thing.
He washed his hands. History rhymes.
I mean, you see that not only in governments but in families and men and fathers just
washing their hands. We can't allow it. And if you think that the way government is run doesn't have echoes in the families of this country, you're high. Of course it does, because people respect power. They just do. I'm sorry, but if this was a public, if we were here if we were doing this podcast in a tavern and there were a bunch of people sitting out here listening to us,
it's a great idea.
And it is a good idea. But we're conservative Christians. I'm pretty obviously right leaning. But if Barack Obama walked through the door, people would stand up and they would, even if they disagreed wholeheartedly right-leaning and really not like Obama, we have an understanding that we salute the uniform, and especially coming from our position, right?
Right.
Those Barack Obama, I know from personal anecdotes that he was not liked by the military. But if he went on Marine One, did those Marines salute? They absolutely do. We understand that you respect authority and you just naturally respect power. So if the president is immoral, you saw this with Clinton. And none of these men, by the way, who I disagree with or didn't vote with, it's not we're saying that they were absolutely evil or the most evil they could ever be. But there were consequences. Clinton had his dalliances with rank immorality, right? And so if you think that didn't have a follow-on effect, okay, and so on and so forth, then again, I just think you're delusional. Sorry, gentle Ron, meek and mild.
Well, you want to leave? We're up against the clock.
Well, we got 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
10 minutes.
What do you want to leave in this conversation? Because I mean, we could talk for hours about this, about the nuances of, because the Christian nationalism conversation is so.
Well, I'm going to lean in
out there.
Am I still in the frame?
If you're out of focus,
Okay, is that my fault? I'll stay right here. I'll stay right here. Men, because I know this is probably, it's got to be 85, 90% male audience.
Oh, for sure.
If not
I
higher.
hope so.
Let me tell you.
Men and my mother.
If you're a podcasting listening young female and you're choosing to spend your time looking at this, you got issues, okay? So Brian's a good looking guy, but he's happily married. But anyway, I want you to understand that we do not believe in the fascism of the living. We are connected historically. We have been grafted in, the Bible says, and that's not just into your daddy. That's into that history all the way back into Adam and Noah and Moses and to those guys who faithfully led the restoration after exile, into Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Zerubbabel and Habakkuk and Micah. And you are grafted in, but you're not only grafted into that. God sovereignly, Acts 17, Paul says he has defined the boundaries of your habitation. Talking to these Greeks, okay? He is radically sovereign. He chose where you live. And so we've been grafted in to Washington and like it or not, Jefferson and Witherspoon and Hamilton and the Civil War and Lincoln. And this is your history and you should know it. You should know how these things, you don't have to be an expert. but you should know how and why these things have developed the way they are so that you can speak with love and, as our friend Todd said at lunch today, with a little bit of salt in how do we preserve that which is good. It doesn't mean it has to look just, I'm not yearning for the antebellum South. I'm going to sit on and drink my mint julep on the, and have my plantation. And say, no, absolutely not. History moves one direction, but we're where we are because of where we've been. And so you got to know what that path has been so you can steer the car. And you can help steer the car. And if again, this radical, this fascism of the living, if you don't think you're connected to what has come before you, and you don't think you're connected to what's going to come after, if you think it's just all about you, I'm sorry, you're just wrong. You can be a futurist, if you take a futurist, but if you're dispensational with regards to eschatology, that's fine. I would just argue, does it look like God is done with what he's doing here? It doesn't seem so to me. Okay. I'm Reformed, and so that's not, I think we got a long road ahead of us of the church. I believe that God is going to fulfill all those promises that, for instance, the dispensationalists would say are going to come true for a land-based Israel. I'm saying I believe all those promises are the future for the church. And whoever's right, we've got a path ahead. Okay, we can argue about that and have a good argument and hug it out. Okay, that's an in-house debate. But what's not a debate is that there is no future. There is a future. And if you don't know how to steer that, get both hands on the wheel and an eye that's checking that rear view occasionally, then you have no hope. You're driving at night without the headlights on. Don't be that guy. Okay? Just don't be.
Yes, sir. Let's go. Ron, thank you.
You bet, buddy.